Director Shim and the Korean American Educational Association for not only hosting us tonight, but also for enabling me to come over to Korea in 2016 as a researcher, senior scholar, and to do my project on journalism and interviewing Korean adoptees about moving back here to live. And as Heidi said, that part of my I guess qualitative research was to do a podcast, start a podcast, and my background is a radio reporter, so I thought it was kind of a natural thing to use audio to interview adoptees, and also I wanted to come back to Korea myself and live here and have that experience. So I'll just quickly go a little bit about myself. I was adopted in 1971 from, I believe I'm from Pyeongtaek, and went to the metropolis of Meadowlands, Minnesota, of 134 people. So you can feel my pain. But and then we moved to a couple other towns, but always under about 1,000 people. So I grew up in a very white environment, was the only person of color, growing up. And this is some early photos of my family, my mother, and I have two brothers who are not adopted. They are my parents' biological sons, and they adopted me first, and then they had two kids biologically, and so there's some pictures of us. And so I guess we'll jump right to my year, 2016, just kind of run through it quickly. I came over, and just some impressions of Korea is the food. I think a lot of you living in Korea now will attest that the food is so great and cheap, and that's something that has really stuck with me even after I went back to the States, just really missing the food. And then just some impressions of living in Seoul, just K-pop culture. It's crowded, it's youthful, it's exciting. I mean, Seoul is really great. And through the year, I also had some loneliness. Not reunited with my biological or Korean family. And so, in a sense, coming to Korea, I had these feelings of wanting to belong. And it also, I felt the fact that I was not reunited, and yet perhaps physically closer to my Korean family, it accentuated a loneliness, a different kind of loneliness that I hadn't experienced before. I hadn't anticipated, and it's something that I experienced by living here. And also, I also experienced some really extreme kindness by Korean people. This guy in the middle, Jay, he was the cable guy, the one guy that spoke English at Mapo Cable. And if any of you who's, my Korean is pretty poor, and so if you're ever calling a company for services, they direct you to the one guy that speaks Korean or speaks English. So that was Jay. And so he learned during Chuseok that I was I didn't have family here that I knew of, and he invited me to his family's Chuseok. And it's kind of odd because we had never actually met in person. We just talked. He was setting up my cable. But it was super, it was very touching. And actually I didn't even realize it until after it happened, like how strange that was, because even his girlfriend had not been to his family's Chuseok, because not until they're married, right? So then they brought me, and there's all these questions of, who I was, but no, they were great, and they made me feel very welcome. And then, many adoptees that I've talked to, that when you move back, there is this, there's just this drive that you've got to make up for lost time with your Korean language ability, and so trying to shove 20 years into 1 year, and it's not realistic, but you could see that's 4 different schools I went to, and bought all the textbooks, and so it was kind of a losing battle, but I did try my best. And then I was here from 2016 to 2017, and I was part of the International Press Corps. Many of you I see were here at the time too, and it's just an interesting time to be in Korea. And it's since continued to be interesting here, but with the fall of Park Geun-hye and the protests in the streets, and you can see how Korea, there's changes happening in Korea, which is really kind of exciting. And then also, a visit that left a big impression was I went to the House of Sharing and to meet some of the Korean hominies and to learn more about that part of Korean history. And in the middle, there's Alexis Dutton. She was also a Fulbright scholar, and she's kind of an expert on this issue. So, and through GOAL, which is a NGO, Nathan? NGO? Operated by adoptees for adoptees, and provide a host of services for adoptees living in Korea and not living here as well, but one of them being birth search. And so with their help, I created flyers, and Subin came on the right. He's a Korean national, and he was a GOAL volunteer, and he helped me to go back to my orphanage, and that was a great help, and to find out more information. Ultimately, I didn't uncover much, but just having someone to go with me. And Subin's got an interesting story because his older sister was adopted to Australia, and so before he was born, and so he has a connection to adoption, which is why he was probably volunteering. So we'll just go right to the podcast. I didn't know anything about podcasting, and I sort of learned as I went. And if any of you have listened to the earlier podcasts, it's, I'm definitely learning the technology, but it's not news probably to most people in the room, but I'll just do kind of an overview that, about 200,000 Korean adoptees or children were adopted to the West via intercountry adoption. And, at the time, you talk to different organizations, and they say 500 or more adoptees at any given time are living in the country. That number can ebb and flow. People are here on different visas, so it's hard to really calculate how many people are kind of coming and going out of the country. So, but hundreds. And evidence points that there's more and more each year that are coming. And, if you think about the waves, second waves, the waves of adoptees who are coming back to Korea, people are at a time in their lives where maybe they can make the move here. So it is, as we're getting older, I think more adoptees are choosing to, come back and have that experience. So it makes sense. One big reason was in 1999 the creation of the F4 visa, and that many here are aware of it, but that's a visa that creates opportunities for overseas Koreans. Adoptees can apply for it, and you can stay up to 3 years, and it's renewable. And so you find that it enables some people to live here on a longer term basis and to have more privileges for jobs. But one of the reasons I wanted to do my podcast was to let adoptees tell their stories in their own words. A lot of times we have heard about adoption through the voices of adopted parents and researchers who oftentimes are adoptive parents as well. And so that narrative has really shaped how we've thought about adoption for decades. That's slowly changing. There's more and more adoptees writing memoirs, documentaries, first person, blogging, which is great. And the more opportunities and platforms for adoptees' voices to be, coming to the forefront, I think should be encouraged. And it's happening, so it's great. And I think it's having an effect on the discussion about intercountry adoption. Just some figures, the website, I think, one or two people are finding it, so it's good. And I found that since I've started doing it, that consistently, I feel like, it's surprising where people are finding the website, from Ivory Coast to whatever. I mean, the countries, it's crazy. So I don't know. There's interest out there. So I have 37 episodes so far. So I interviewed, I think, around 25 adoptees in Korea when I was here for my grant year. I was here about 10 months, and then I went back to the States, and then I continued the interviews. And so not everyone's story is about living in Korea as adults, returning to Korea. So some have to do with reunions, some have to do with maybe they lived in Korea and have returned to the States. So I had to sort of open up the topic, but I was still interested in the stories, and I felt like, it's so personally enriching for me to have, meet people and hear their stories. So I wanted to continue it, even though I'm no longer on the grant. And the podcast is split about evenly. It's about 50-50. We've got half women, about half male. There's 2 people. Presently, I'm not sure what their gender orientation is or how they identify, so I just left that blank. But a good many had lived in Korea 3 or more years, or intended to, when I interviewed them. So, I think there was a sense of the people, and it could have just been self-selection, people that felt ready to talk about their experience in Korea, maybe had lived here a few years, or people who had moved here maybe had this intention that they open-ended, they didn't know how long it would be. So I think the project attracted people who were really interested in a longer experience. But like over a third had lived in Korea on a shorter term basis, maybe a year or 2. Myself, I lived here only a year. And then, a smaller percentage had never returned to live, and those are folks that I interviewed in the States after I came back. A range of nationalities, although most tended to be American. There were 2 Dutch, and one of the Dutch adoptees had reclaimed his, or had gotten his dual. 1 French, 1 Australian, and 2 were never naturalized, although they are permanent residents of the US. They never received citizenship, and that is an ongoing issue that folks are trying to address. But and those 2 people that I interviewed had recovered their Korean citizenship, so they're able to get their Korean passports. The reasons, not probably a surprise to anyone here, but there's some were motivated because they had reunited with their Korean family. Some wanted to, and so they thought moving here might aid their search. Some wanted to come for identity reasons, sense of belonging. And not everybody had that sort of like deep kind of reasons. Some people just thought, hey, it's an adventure and I can come to Korea and I'm Korean, so why not? So there was kind of a range in the reasons people came. In terms of reunion, so this is a bit skewed because a higher percentage of interviewees had reunited with their Korean family. Generally speaking, the government numbers in the last few years indicate less than 15% of adoptees who search in any given year actually find Korean or reunited. So it's a much lower number. But in terms of the podcast, I think a higher percentage of folks who had reunited felt motivated to share their story or were interested to. This is kind of interesting to me. So, most were still in contact with their family after reunion, but almost a third were somewhat estranged after the reunion, and some had no contact anymore. So, and there's a lot of different reasons, and people in their stories talk about it, and I'll probably touch on it later, but some of that has to do with cultural and language barriers, expectations. One thing that I've learned as I've interviewed people about the reunion, that it's not an easy, reunion is not easy, and there's just so many factors that go into it, and trying to establish relationships is complicated. 18% of the the sample wanted to find family but were unable to. And there's always some kind of sad stories where, well, disappointment, where one adoptee had found their Korean mother. The mother did not want to be contacted or did not want to meet. And one adoptee, a male, expressed no interest to search. And he's someone who has lived in Korea for 10 years. So, and in that time, still no interest. Those who lived here, it's no surprise, made learning or recovering Korean language a priority. You can see there. But I thought this was an interesting discovery for me is some folks that I had interviewed, some adoptees, even they had lived here long term, they had decided that they gave up learning Korean and that they felt much more authentically themselves to speak primarily in English, or probably, in English. And so I thought that was interesting, and people had different reasons for it. And one adoptee who has not returned to live, she was adopted as a teenager, and so her Korean was fluent, I think. But some common threads. These are complicated stories, often in reunion. There's some disappointment in post-reunion stories. Communication, cultural barriers are things I heard in people's stories. And also the birth search process, that there's a perception that the agencies are not always forthcoming with information. They don't always, information seems withheld, and there's different reasons for that. There's the special adoption law in 2012, which is undergoing possible revisions now, but it's where, Korean privacy laws, the adoptee is not always given information about their biological family, even if there's record, because they have to get consent first, so from the Korean parents. So that often can result in disappointment in the search process, and especially if the adoptee knows the information is there, it can be quite frustrating. But also common threads were this sense of belonging and a comfort here in Korea that they may not have experienced in their countries where they held citizenship, so or countries they grew up. And but there were languages, a big thing that I heard is still a barrier, and sometimes limited employment opportunities, not able to pursue the types of careers that they might have otherwise been able to in their home country, or not home country, in their adopted country. Let's see. So I think we'll just go right into the podcast itself, and we'll listen to some excerpts. I have 3 excerpts ready from adoptees I interviewed. So Eric Sharp, he's 38. He grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. He's an actor. He lived in Korea for 6 months in his late 20s. He ended up moving back for a job. He and his partner at the time both got acting jobs that they couldn't pass up. While he was here, he really hadn't intended to search, but after he found out, they decided they were going back. He thought, why not? I have 7 days left in Korea. Don't know when I'm going to go back again. Let's look at the file. And his parents' Korean IDs were there. And so there wasn't much else, but the IDs were there. And so, which is pretty crazy because that information is usually pretty rare to find in your file. He learned that he knew this, I guess, but he was 2.5 years old when he was adopted. He had an older brother who was 4 years old at the time that Eric was adopted. So Eric's story is like a lot of adoptees' stories. There's a lot of family separation, disruption. The parents eventually separated, and his older brother also was separated from his parents. He grew up in a Catholic workhouse here in Korea. So there was just, separation is a common theme in this family. Eric doesn't understand all the reasons why, but his Korean isn't very advanced. But he also has come to understand that even if his Korean was fluent, he doesn't think he would get all the answers. That, culturally, he finds that there's a lot of secrets in Korean families that make it difficult to talk about these kind of really painful things that happen. Family separation is very painful. So this clip is about him and talking about his relationship with his brother and when he kind of felt the enormity of the loss for both of them.
See the similarity, but it's not like even my brother and I, if you put us right next to each other, you wouldn't necessarily guess. And so, of course, as adoptees, we're like, oh my God, are you really my brother? But you find out whether or not your name is actually your name, of course, because some adoptees find out that's not the case. We found out that mine was the name that I was given at birth. And so we share that syllable, right? We both have Kyung in our name, which is very common for Korean siblings. And because of his identification number being there, it was really no question about it. And so really more where I see the similarities are our habits, actually. So like Hyung and I are actually kind of similar. Like we both really like drawing and grew up doing that type of drawing. We both have a really big laugh. I think it's fair to say we're both kind of, happy, positive people for the most part.
Is he funny?
Yes, he's so funny. Oh my God. And so I'm so relieved because, not to be too stereotypical, but I've met a lot of very severe Korean men and very kind of serious, and I don't think that's their fault. I think it has to do with being forced into military service and then being put on this very strict, career path where you're trying to provide for everybody. And so I don't think that that's unfounded in a lot of Korean men. But yeah, when I found out how funny Hyung was, it was such a relief. Because as we talked about earlier, like humor has been a big part of kind of my life and how I relate to the world.
Is he an artist as well?
He's not professionally, but he loves making like little models and drawing, and he's really good with his hands. But yeah, didn't get a chance, I don't think, to pursue those things in a professional way.
So it sounds like, growing up, you didn't feel maybe a conscious loss being an adoptee. But what's it like to meet, like, your Hyung, and he experienced the loss of you? Because obviously you don't have memory of him, but he does of you.
It's so funny, though, because growing up, this is before I looked at my adoption file, I never thought intellectually that I had a brother, but it felt like it. And you're right, like even at that point, it wasn't like loss. It was just a weird kind of phantom memory. And so when I found out it was true, then you start to get that inkling of loss. And then it wasn't another 10 years, until I actually met him. It's heartbreaking to hear that he was a 4-year-old wondering where I was, and that no one would give him a straight answer. And he still feels that very deeply. Like, he said that many times. And he still has a lot of anger toward our parents because of that dishonesty and those secrets, those Korean secrets. So it's hard. It's hard to know that he was in pain for so many years because of that. And then, when we were reunited, his way of coping with that or dealing with that, it was so beautiful. Like, this isn't the first time that I met him. This is like when I'd come back, and then I actually got to spend some time with him in his town. He lives in Ansan, which is southwest of Seoul. And, we're like doing go-karts and going to batting cages, and he's like feeding me like hot dogs and popcorn and all these things. And it wasn't until later that I realized that he was trying to like relive our childhood that we missed together a little bit, or at least that's my take on it. he at the time lived in a postage stamp apartment. It's just a hovel, like ramen bowls stacked to the ceiling in the dirty kitchen, and
The bachelor lifestyle.
yes, a bachelor lifestyle. And so it was pretty clear that I wasn't going to sleep there, not because I said it, but it was just like, he's like, yeah, this is my apartment, throw the bag down. And then we actually went and stayed at the Jjimjilbang, at the sauna. And I'll always remember that too, because as you know, when you go to the Jjimjilbang, you kind of have to strip down. And that is a situation where in most cases you're with another adult dude that you don't know and you're getting naked. And in most situations in my life that would make me pretty uncomfortable, but it felt completely natural. And he looked at me, because we're in the kind of part of the Jjimjilbang where you like scrub down before you get into the hot baths. It's like a just any like other sauna. But he's looking at me, and he says, in our country, family washes family. And so he just like took the sponge and just kind of like scrubbed my back a little bit. And that is when the real kind of grief for our relationship really set in, because I consider myself a very kind of physical, corporeal person, and physical touch is very important to me. And I'd never experienced touch in that way, from my brother. And so, and once again, like, listeners are probably like, that's so bizarre, and it is in a way, but it felt like exactly what was supposed to happen. And then, an hour later, we're just like drunk on soju and just like crying and just talking about all those years. At the time that I was reunited, it would have been 26 or 27 years since we'd seen each other. And you just, that realization that you can never get that back.
Okay, and the next adoptee we're going to talk about here is Joy Alessi, and she's from Houston, Texas. She's 52. She currently works with Adoptee Rights Campaign, which is working to advocate for full citizenship rights for international, transnational adoptees. They estimate 35 to 75,000 adoptees did not receive citizenship from the country they were adopted to as children. This is not just Korea, but other countries as well. She was adopted as a 7-month-old, but a lot of disruption happened in her case too. Adoptive parents soon divorced after her adoption. And Alessi was never naturalized. She was raised by an adoptive mom and a stepfather. There was abuse in her family, and she was removed by the state of California when she was, I think, 14, and put into foster care. And she was a ward of the state until she aged out at 18. And did not realize that she wasn't a citizen until she was about 25. She had already married, but marriage does not grant you citizenship. And so it was a great shock to her, even though she knew she always had documents and things that she carried around all the time, and she could talk her way into jobs and things. And a lot of times people took pity on her that she didn't have the right documents. But at 25, she wanted to go to Mexico with her new husband, and she couldn't get a U.S. passport. And that came as a big shock to her. So, Clay.
You became homeless. Talk to us about that period.
At the time, I think that I didn't quite view it as homelessness. Looking back at it many, many years, and in fact, for most of my life, I had forgotten it. And when I started connecting with adoptees, and actually when I started telling my story, which is really interesting, I began with just a few small recollections of the facts, but it didn't occur to me, probably until about a year ago, that I had been homeless.
Where did you stay? And
I was doing a lot of couch surfing, and sometimes that didn't work out so well. Well, actually, most of the time it didn't work out so well, and there were times that it was actually on the street, homeless. So wherever homeless people go to find shelter, I was pretty naive, I suppose, so I was unaware of shelters. So it's not like I went to a shelter or a homeless shelter. So it was just kind of survival, I suppose. And thinking back, also, I had run away in my teens, so there was some familiarity with how to kind of navigate on the streets a little bit. Fortunately, I didn't have to do a lot of that. Most of it was just moving from place to place, couch surfing and trying to find people who would allow me to spend the night there.
it strikes me as, at that age, you're a teenager and surviving on your own, whether or not you're on the streets or in someone's house or on a couch. I think probably your experiences set you up to survive,
Right.
but that is, that takes a lot of inner strength.
I'm really not sure how I got through it. And thinking now today, of course, what I know and having established myself and have been established for many, many years, I think, my goodness, I was just a baby. How did I get through that? I'm not quite sure. I had the original green card. I was told that it was a green card, but it had my baby picture. And I was told that it was simply just part of the entry requirements as I came in for adoption. So it wasn't explained to me, you're a legal permanent resident, this is what this is, nothing. And of course it was my baby picture. So I discovered that at the time that I discovered I wasn't a citizen, and I had the baby green card, and they said, oh, that's your green card, and by the way, it looks like it's never been renewed, and we need to confiscate that. And at the time I said, wait a minute, that's the only infant picture I have of myself, and of course that didn't matter to them. They said, we need to take care of this. We need to at least get your green card renewed. You are a legal permanent resident. And really pointed me in the direction of the Korean consulate. But before that, I divulged that I had behaved like a citizen, and that included voting. And they said, oh, whoa, you voted. And I said, well, yes, I signed at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Do you want to register to vote? And then I went to vote, thought I was doing my civic duty. And they said, yes, that's a real problem, and one that you could be deported for, prosecuted first and then deported. I was like, wait a minute, what does that mean? And clearly this particular agent, I know she knew that this was a shock, and I know that she clearly understood that this was not an intentional thing, but nonetheless, she said, you're going to need a lawyer. And so later I followed up with a lawyer, and I have done so since, to present time. And I was told, yeah, you should just not ever apply for citizenship. You should just keep your permanent resident status, be glad that you have that, and don't ever rock the boat. And the Korean consulate wasn't any different. It was really not wonderful experience. They were unaware 25 years ago. They were really not aware of why a Korean person would be in the United States and be coming to them for services, and why I didn't speak Korean, and baffled by my presence and my inability to communicate with them. So what I had to do at that time is I had to find a Korean translator. I had a stack full of documents I had eventually received from my mother. The process for the Korean passport was very difficult because of the language, because they didn't understand. But I eventually got it done, and I just held on to that. It was my, one piece of solid information that said, at least you have this. And as I learned later, it enabled me to travel, because I later became a flight attendant. Interestingly enough, I now have a relationship with the Korean consulate here in Houston, as I've kind of helped other adoptees, local adoptees, come through the same process here. It's just now changing. They're spending a lot of resources on this issue. the citizenship issue from a legislative point. They're very interested in that. But from the practical point, because they're limited as to what they can do, but they can provide services, consular services for Korean adoptees who don't have citizenship. And so the first step in that is to provide them with some government identification, so a passport, a Korean passport. It's a process, and each case is a little bit different because, of course, as adoptees, we each have a different set of documents, and so some take a little bit more. With males, there's the issue of military service. There's that requirement, but they are addressing it. But it's interesting to me that it's taken 25 years to get there.
Okay. Okay. And just a footnote on Joy's story. She has applied for citizenship now. She's waiting. I think it's been over a year. She's still waiting. So it's taking a long time politically. It's very difficult out of Texas right now. But and also the citizenship, the Child Citizenship Act, is it, or the ACA? In 2001, that act actually, it did not provide retroactive rights for all adoptees, only up to a certain year, like I think 1983. But it did provide, it didn't make it not a criminal offense anymore for if you had been adopted and you voted. So that is no longer grounds for deportation. So that is one development that happened. Okay. All right, and so just our last one. Some of you here may know her, Kim Thompson. She's lived in Korea for 8 years.
And I found out that.
Oops. She lived in Korea for 8 years. She's 42. She moved back about a year and a half ago. She's an artist and writer. She lived in Korea for, like I said, 8 years, I think from about 32 to 40. She had a difficult time with her birth search because she felt that Holt would not release the names of her family members, even though she knew they had them. So it was a bit of a struggle to get those names. Eventually she did reunite with them, and she, after doing so, decided to move to Korea. And she describes her reunion as being this kind of joyous, wonderful experience. But over time, that relationship did not really develop the way she had hoped, and there's some disappointment there about that relationship.
And I found out that I was really angry, and I didn't know how angry I was. And cliche though it is, or I've come to understand that I've been deeply grieving my whole life, but not conscious of that grief, because again, I think that goes back to at least the way that I was raised, and being a second wave adoptee of coming over to the States in the 70s, and the language that was used around things at the time. It was always about almost like trying to forget or suppressing that, like, your Oma loved you so much that she gave you up, and that's the end of the conversation. And so there was never space for my sorrow. So living in Seoul put my sorrow right in front of me, whether or not I wanted it to. But also on other levels, it helped me return to myself, to consciously experience for the first time in my life what it is to be part of a racial majority. Is and was probably one of the most impactful things. And though I do not wish to have, if it were up to me, I would have grown up with my Oma. I can see blessing's not the word for it. The silver lining is that I was always very aware of how amazing it was for my face to blend in, and that the things that made me stand out are the things that are part of my individuality and aren't about just my skin or just my eyes or just these things that in the States are constantly causing me to stand out, and that I have no way of hiding here. And that was really powerful. And there were, no matter how, like anyone, I would have absolutely awful days there. But all I had to do was go outside and see faces like my own. And it would, if even just for a moment, lift that heaviness. Because I'd be like, wow, there's not a single white face anywhere. And that was so beautiful. And it's something that I miss very deeply here in Minneapolis, which is not to say that I don't love my friends so much here, but I am very aware of how much I do not fit in anymore. You know, I think with friends in Korea, we'd sometimes joke about how there's the BK and the AK, the before Korea and the after Korea experience for an adoptee. And that, you know, before I went to Korea, I made all the self-deprecating jokes. One friend, you know, Kim Stoker often refers to it as like internalized, not just internalized racism, but internalized Orientalism. And I definitely did all of those things. And then those jokes stopped being funny. Because I started to take pride in who I was, and I'd never had a sense of pride about being Korean. I think, and again, I've heard many adoptees say this, where, you know, growing up, I would look in the mirror and feel like I was born into the wrong, not the wrong body, but the wrong race. That I should have been, that what was looking back at me should have been a blonde with blue eyes, white girl. Like, that's how the world I was raised in. And so to not see that was really painful. Whereas now, after having lived in Seoul, I'm like, I'm exactly in the right body, in the right race, in the right people group. Like, this is who I am. And it's not, the problem isn't me in this society. The problem is this society that I live in. And that was a really important thing. And even, you know, living in Seoul, even the quote unquote smaller things that were very big is eating the food. Sometimes I talk about this with friends, that we go out for chimek, for like chicken and beer, or we'd go out, you know, and we'd be eating, and we'd talk about how, maybe not the chimek, but that we were eating the food that we had been nurtured on when we were in the womb, that this was part of our DNA, this is part of how we came into the world. And so to return to those tastes and those flavors and those ingredients, that was really important. And that was, again, where I could have, you know, maybe the worst day and feel so frustrated with Korea and Koreans and just want to leave. And then all I had to do was, and I lived location-wise, in terms of where I lived with food, it was the best place ever. And so all I had to do was walk out my door and go eat amazing, amazing food, and I would feel better again. And to have that feeling of like, I'm Korean, but I'm not Korean, but I have a neighborhood that's mine now for 8 years, and I have my favorite spots, and they know me and I know them, and even though I can't communicate very well with them, they know what it got to the point where there's certain spots they knew exactly what I was going to order, and they just bring it out. And that felt good because it felt like I was a part of something that I had always thought I could never be a part of. So, you know, it's, friends here would sometimes laugh about when you know, or would tease me when I talk about, oh yeah, you know, one of the best things is going out to eat hui, like to eat sashimi. But it was because it was to eat what was always supposed to have been mine, so to speak. Someone recently asked me, you know, what it felt like when I first returned to Korea in December of 2007. And when I was a teenager, or maybe in my early 20s or whatever, I had read The Joy Luck Club. And there's a line that Amy Tan uses at the end about where she talks about returning to China, and that the moment she set her feet on Chinese soil, that she became Chinese again. And so when I landed at Incheon, I remember thinking, is that how I'm going to feel? And it wasn't. I didn't feel like, oh, I'm Korean now. But I felt like all of my particles were returning, and that particles of myself that I didn't even know I'd been missing were coming back to me. One of the things that Koreans talk a lot about, and that there's been, I think, more and more writing around, has been the notions of Han and Jang. And they're untranslatable words. But living in Seoul, I can feel them in my bones. Like, I feel it in my marrow. I can feel it with people. When a Korean friend was first explaining the words to me, and again, I'm not good at Korean, I just knew what they meant. I could feel it inside. And it also helped me, it was again where I was like, oh, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. I come from something, and these are things that come from what it is to be Korean. This isn't just about my immediate Oma Appa bloodline. This is about ancestors, and it goes way back, and that this is the soil, and that, you know, and that's another thing I would often think about walking around in my neighborhood is I would just think, I'm walking on, you know, it's, let's say it was 2014, and I think it's totally modern day Seoul. Everyone's on their phones. There's more and more people are getting tattoos. I was in the arts district of Seoul, but I would think beneath all of this is soil that my ancestors most likely walked on. And this is part of me. And I felt a connection with, I had never known what it was to feel connected to a land. People talk about it. I understood the concept in my mind, but living in Seoul, I experienced it in my heart, in my being of, this is what I come from quite literally, and I am born of this. And that was also incredibly impactful.
Okay. So I guess that wraps it up for me. These are 3, I've done 37 episodes now, and if you're interested, they're at adoptedpodcast.com. For now, I'm in Korea, and I've been doing some interviews too, and if anybody here would like to be, on the podcast, definitely reach out. And I'm hoping to continue these. I do this on my free time. I'm a full-time TV reporter right now, but I really do, it's a passion project for me, and I think these stories are so important to get out. And I think the platform, I do some editing, but I think the fact that people aren't being quoted, that this is actually your voice telling your story, I think that's just so powerful. And I've learned so much as well. When I started the project, I think like a lot of adoptees who are maybe late to exploring their identity have this notion that everyone had the same kind of adoptive family experience, and that everyone feels the same way about adoption, or that, and one thing that I've definitely learned is that's not the case. And there are commonalities, there's things that we share, but there's also, we have similar starting points, but then our lives really can take on very different details, and we are individual stories too. So that's been really interesting for me to learn as I grow, as well as into my own adoptee identity. But also the reason I do this is to share. It's a way for adoptees to share their stories with others. So does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Because you've done more than 3 dozen podcasts, I'm wondering if you think about your own adoption experience differently, or if you've learned more about it.
Yeah, definitely. I've gone through different phases of how I feel about my adoption story. My adoption story, by no means, it's not a perfect story. And so I've gone through different waves, and then different how I felt about it, and moving back to Korea too, gave me a perspective as well. One adoptee that I interviewed, he talked about how, I think there's that duality question, like, are you Korean or are you American, or whatever country that you were raised in. And one adoptee actually put it that it's actually, you're an adoptee, and that's like a third leg of the stool, that it's not so much a question of Korean or American in his case, but he really found that his identity was really as an adoptee. And I think that really kind of opened the doors to how I thought about things too, and to realize that it's not just a black and white kind of thing, and that we have to fit ourselves into one or the other, or that being an adoptee is itself an identity. And so I thought that was really interesting. So yeah, for sure. And I'm still on a journey, so.
You took my question.
That was the same question? Can you come up with another one? No.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, okay.
Just had a technical question. How did you find participants? Was it difficult or?
You know, yeah, I mean, it got easier because the more I did them and had them published, people could go and listen and they're like, okay, you know. So the very beginning, Alicia was the first person who volunteered, and bless her heart, I had nothing to show for it. So she just totally took a risk with me and told her story, and it was she had quite a traumatic story, and she, you know, just a lot of really strength in her story. And so she shared it, but she was also at a point, I think she was ready to share. And so, you know, but I think when I first arrived, I kind of, you know, told people about it, and I kind of, you know, I think in the beginning had to sort of beg my friends and people I knew to come on. But over time, I think it's gotten a little bit easier, and some people actually have contacted me that I didn't know, and so I feel like that's been like more recently, which has been great. If I had the funds to travel, there would be a lot more people, at least in the States, who would be willing to do their story. But at this time, I do these only in person because I think you get kind of an intimate quality when you're face-to-face as opposed to like a Skype interview or something. You just can't get that same kind of feeling. And I think that you want to create that sort of intimacy, because then as a listener, you feel like you're right there listening to that person. So I think that's kind of the beauty of a podcast, is you have that kind of intimate space. But yeah, that's it's gotten easier. I know when I first got here, people said, "Oh, you're gonna have a hard time getting people to talk to you," and you know, I was kind of scared of that at first, like it would be difficult. I mean, you're asking people to really talk about private things, you know, their family. It's not always comfortable, but I've been pleasantly surprised that, and I also think, I don't know, but I feel like as more adoptees are telling their stories and blogging and writing, and I feel like there's just, you know, there's power in numbers. I think there's just more people are willing to share their stories now, because they see the impact it has on others. And so I don't know if it's, you know, what it is, but I think in the last few years, it's definitely been easier for me to find people willing to share. Okay, let's Scott, and then you.
You said it was follow on.
go for it.
Okay.
Sure. All right. I wanted to. You said that you hadn't done any podcasting before, so
Yeah.
How did you get into it? Talk about, you know, what type of microphones are you using, and how has the technology you're using changed as you've everything going?
Well, I just relied a lot on like my audio experience. So I use shotgun mics, and I have a professional grade recorder. You know, all in, you can spend, you know, like $600-700. Equipment. It's not terribly expensive. I don't, you know, I'm not using like professional cameras or anything. I just take photos with my iPhone. And so I did that, and then I did ask a lot of questions. I had some friends who had podcasted, tried to figure out how to make a WordPress site, which I just used like a template. And then, you know, I just asked some friends, like, how did you start your podcast? And, you know, it's not that hard once you get started. I think the part that, you know, that I think evolved over time is when you're talking to people and you can kind of, you know, a lot of times, most of the time I don't know what people's story is before I talk to them. And so once you start talking, you can kind of guide the questions, and you can kind of see what the arc is in the story. So that's something that I've gotten better at in time. So usually these interviews take about an hour, and I edit them down to about 30 minutes mostly. So I've just gotten faster doing that. I edit on Adobe Audition. which is just a software, but there's other softwares out there. There's free softwares too that you can use. And yeah, and I just, you know, I guess little by little, I've gotten a little bit faster and better at it, so hopefully. Okay, John.
All right, 2 questions. Because actually his question reminded me of another one. But you mentioned earlier about how your background in kind of journalism and was it newscast or broadcasting kind of led you into. But I was wondering if you could elaborate. Was there a moment where you just decided that, you know, adoptee, you know, everyone talks about having a moment where they decide that's what I want to do. Did the Fulbright come first, or did the idea for doing an adapted kind of podcast come first? And the second question is, what are you going to do with all? I mean, have you thought about, now that the scholarship's over, but you mentioned this is kind of a passion project. Is there something like a goal or an ultimate?
Like my book deal and movies?
Yeah, well, yeah. Maybe Netflix or something.
Well, let me answer that question first. I don't have really an end goal. I just, right now, just keeping doing what I'm doing. Maybe this will last another year. I don't know. But as long as I... What?
170. Wow.
And actually, John was on my podcast, so if you want to listen to his story, he's on there. We talked for like 3 hours. But yeah, so I don't know what the end plan is. And then for me, I just, you know, I was 2015. I was laid off from a job, and you know, I really started thinking about, okay, what's next? And you know, I think I was having some career burnout too, because I had been a reporter for a long time. And instead of like the next ambulance chasing story, or the next bonding bill story, you know, what would I love to be doing? And I thought about, I'd love to talk to other adoptees about going back to Korea to live. And it's something that I had just recently started thinking about myself in 2015. So I really hadn't thought much about my adoptee identity. And I think like commonly that can happen is you start to like, after a time, wonder if all the things that happened in your life had to do with adoption. And something that I wanted to explore. And I thought the only way I could do that is to go to Korea. And so then I applied and I got the Fulbright, so that's what happened. Did that answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Was there one more over here? Okay.
Yeah, so my name is Mary, and I'm here as a fan.
Oh.
I'm not affiliated with any organization out here, but I ended up finding your podcast right after I went through my own reunion. And what I loved about it was the fact that there were a lot of interviews with adoptees who have reunited and their experiences from like right off the bat to 10 years. And there wasn't a lot of, there still aren't many resources for people like me who have
That's
reunited,
true. Yeah.
and it's kind of a roller coaster. And so
Yeah.
I loved your podcast almost immediately because it kind of helped me not feel completely insane, I guess, at all. But because of that, it kind of, like, now that I've reunited, I'm really interested on really how the birth family is feeling. And because you can't communicate that well, I like to understand them. And so it kind of got me interested in seeing if you would potentially want to interview birth mothers. Are you having like dual interviews between the adoptee and their families and having that sort of dialogue?
There's
between
one
the
episode, I don't know if you found it yet, but it's with Soo-Bin Kim, the guy that helped me, and Hannah,
Okay.
who lived here for a while, like last year, I think, the Australian adoptee. And I actually, he speaks English, so I was able to interview them separately, which I thought was interesting, not together. And it was interesting to show in families how the stories can be different.
Right.
And that's painful. It was painful for Hannah, I think, to just realize that. story that she was told and the story that her brother was told about her relinquishment or the circumstances was different. But I thought that was interesting. I wish my Korean was better to do that. I think you're always in that kind of, when it's not your native language, I just don't know how, when it's through a translator, there's so much that gets withheld and nuance and things that I, as an interviewer, may not catch. So that would be difficult, but definitely maybe that's a project for someone who could do it, and I think that would be really valuable. Agree. I think that the first families are their voices we haven't heard from at all. So. Oh, I think they want us to eat, but if anyone has questions, I can keep talking like one-on-one.
Yes, so please join me in here.